In the early morning hours in Los Angeles, while the sprawling city lay wrapped in a coastal fog, an exclusive hillside neighborhood was suddenly pierced by the synchronized flash of red and blue lights. Unmarked vehicles formed a silent perimeter around the gates of a sprawling mansion, a residence accustomed to privacy, exclusivity, and the quiet hum of wealth insulating it from the outside world. Federal agents emerged in tactical formation, moving with deliberate precision toward their target. In minutes, the ornate iron gate was breached, and a search warrant read aloud, the words cutting through the pre-dawn stillness. Inside, offices were methodically sealed. Safes were cracked open. Computers, servers, phones, and encrypted hard drives were cataloged and removed. Every action measured and purposeful, as if each second had been rehearsed 100 times before the operation ever began. At first glance, this might have appeared to be another high-profile immigration enforcement action, the kind of operation Americans had grown accustomed to seeing in evening news cycles. But within minutes, the picture began to shift dramatically. The boxes being carried out bore no hallmarks of typical personal records or immigration files. Electronic devices were being tagged as critical evidence in a major federal investigation. Agents were not searching for people. They were extracting the financial architecture of a hidden empire. And at that moment, investigators understood with absolute clarity that this was not a routine operation. This was the culmination of a trap that had been years in the making. According to federal sources with direct knowledge of the investigation, the raid was the result of 27 months of covert surveillance and financial analysis. No press conferences, no leaked warnings, no public posturing. Just the methodical accumulation of unusual financial reports. Money flowing through shell corporations. Names appearing and reappearing across seemingly unrelated documents. Each fragment was cataloged, cross-referenced, and ultimately traced back to a single nexus point, a Los Angeles mansion that investigators believed served as the central coordination hub for one of the largest underground financial networks ever documented on American soil. The scale of the operation staggered even veteran federal agents. This was not merely human trafficking or immigration fraud operating in isolation. This was a multi-tentacled enterprise encompassing welfare fraud on an industrial scale, sophisticated money laundering operations, and cross-border capital flows that touched 4 continents. Preliminary estimates placed the total value of the network's operations at $1.9 billion, a figure so large it instantly elevated the case beyond ordinary criminal investigation into the realm of national security concern. This was the kind of case where a single misstep could collapse the entire prosecution, which is why every element had been kept classified until the moment agents breached the door. What distinguished this raid from countless others was not simply the numbers or the opulence of the scene. It was how effectively the operation had been concealed for so long. This network did not operate in the traditional shadows. There were no weapons caches or overt displays of violence. There were no easily identifiable signs of criminal enterprise. Instead, investigators found seemingly legitimate businesses, charitable foundations with impressive donor lists, and small-scale money transfers that individually raised no red flags. It was precisely this normality, this veneer of respectability, that made the network so dangerous and so difficult to detect. For federal agencies, the Los Angeles raid did not represent a beginning. It represented a conclusion, the final move in a chess game that had been playing out across multiple jurisdictions for over 2 years. But for the American public, this was merely the first glimpse through a door that had been sealed shut until that morning. Because behind every raided mansion, there exists an entire network still operating elsewhere, with connections that remain to be traced and co-conspirators yet to be identified. And that is precisely why investigators understood that what happened in those early morning hours was merely the visible surface of something far deeper. The Los Angeles raid, shocking as it was, represented only a fraction of a larger operation spanning multiple states, dozens of organizations, and nearly a decade of covert criminal activity. If you want to follow the complete unfolding of this investigation, from how the trap was constructed to what lies ahead, subscribe to Military Power so you do not miss the critical developments as they emerge. To fully comprehend why the Los Angeles raid led investigators to a multi-billion-dollar criminal empire, we need to trace the timeline back to December 2025. In the bitter cold of the American Midwest, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement quietly launched what would become the largest immigration enforcement operation in American history. Operation Metro Surge initially targeted Minnesota, specifically the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. On the surface, it appeared to be a large-scale immigration crackdown, but beneath that surface, it functioned as a strategic operation designed to systematically dismantle criminal networks that had embedded themselves within American institutions for years. The official objective of Metro Surge was stated with deliberate brevity: to apprehend individuals with final deportation orders, particularly those with serious criminal histories. According to Department of Homeland Security officials, these were not ordinary undocumented immigrants. These were individuals with documented convictions for violence, sexual abuse, financial fraud, and gang activity, individuals who posed measurable threats to public safety. From the federal perspective, Minnesota had become a critical choke point, a jurisdiction where thousands of deportation orders had accumulated over years without enforcement. To execute the operation, ICE deployed over 2,000 elite agents from multiple states, including specialized teams focused on apprehending high-risk targets, financial analysts tracking asset movements, and intelligence officers monitoring communication networks. Operations were compartmentalized to prevent leaks. Arrests followed unpredictable patterns designed to prevent advance warning. For investigators, speed and tactical surprise were essential because they understood that disrupting any single link prematurely could cause the entire network to scatter and reconstitute elsewhere. Within the first several weeks, the statistics escalated dramatically. Over 4,000 individuals were arrested, many of whom had been living openly in American communities for years, despite carrying final deportation orders. Their records painted a disturbing composite picture: gang members linked to organized violence, individuals with multiple convictions for domestic abuse, repeat offenders with criminal histories spanning more than a decade. For federal authorities, Metro Surge provided concrete evidence of a reality they had been warning about for years. When deportation orders remain unenforced, that enforcement gap becomes an operational advantage for criminal networks. However, it was during the systematic review of arrest records and asset documentation that investigators began to perceive something far more significant than street-level crime. Financial anomalies emerged across seemingly unconnected cases, complex money flows that did not correspond to any legitimate business activity, shell corporations sharing the same registered addresses, cross-linked bank accounts with unexplained international deposits. Names began repeating across different investigations, even when the individuals had never been arrested simultaneously. For the investigative teams, these patterns triggered immediate recognition of a larger, more sophisticated organizational structure operating behind the scenes. Metro Surge, which had begun as an immigration enforcement initiative, was rapidly evolving into a multi-layered investigation with implications that extended far beyond deportation orders. Agents understood they were approaching the perimeter of a large-scale fraud and trafficking system that had never been fully exposed to sunlight, and as the puzzle pieces accumulated, a critical question crystallized within federal law enforcement circles. Who was actually controlling this network, and where was all that money ultimately flowing? As Operation Metro Surge progressed through its second and third weeks, ICE agents began confronting more than abstract statistics. They encountered specific faces, documented names, and case files that should have been closed years earlier. This marked the point where the operation began transforming from an anonymous enforcement action into a systematic exposure of individuals who had existed on the margins of the American legal system for far too long. Among those arrested, numerous profiles caused even experienced investigators to pause and examine the documentation carefully. Street gang members with documented involvement in organized vehicle theft, financial fraud schemes, and armed violence, yet still residing openly in densely populated neighborhoods. Registered sex offenders who had completed sentences and received final deportation orders, yet remained physically present in the United States years after those orders were issued. Most significantly, repeat offenders with extensive criminal records spanning assault, domestic violence, and multiple DUI convictions, yet continuing to re-offend without removal. Each case represented an individual story, but assembled together, they formed a deeply troubling pattern. The most striking commonality was that every individual had valid deportation orders issued years or even decades earlier, yet those orders had never been executed. Some had resided in the United States for another 10 years after their orders were issued. Others for 15 years or longer. During that interval, they did not disappear. They obtained employment, established small businesses, integrated into underground networks, and in numerous documented cases, continued to commit crimes against new victims. From the perspective of federal agents, the relevant question was no longer simply who are these individuals. The relevant question had become, why are they still here? Internal documents revealed that the majority of these individuals had been initially identified and flagged as deportation priorities. However, at the enforcement level, the process had consistently stalled, sometimes indefinitely. Some were released after completing local prison sentences. Others were not retained as required under federal coordination agreements. Others simply disappeared into the gaps between overlapping agency jurisdictions. According to federal law enforcement sources, the fundamental cause was a systematic breakdown in coordination between local and federal authorities. In many documented cases, ICE was not notified when an individual was approaching release from local custody. In jurisdictions with restrictive cooperation policies, local law enforcement was explicitly prohibited from detaining individuals solely on administrative ICE warrants. The predictable result was that the moment local jail doors opened, the individual walked directly back into the community while the deportation order remained dormant in a federal database. For investigators, this represented more than a policy dispute. It represented a systemic operational failure. Every gap in the coordination chain became an opportunity that criminal actors understood how to exploit. These individuals recognized that the actual probability of deportation had been diluted through multiple procedural layers. Over time, that knowledge evolved into a practical sense of immunity. But as Metro Surge investigators systematically assembled the case files, a new pattern began emerging from the data. Several names appeared not only in criminal records but also repeatedly in financial investigation files. Suspicious transactions, businesses registered at identical addresses, connections extending beyond any single individual. This suggested a deeply concerning possibility. The individuals who should no longer be present in the United States might be functioning as operational components within a larger, more sophisticated structure than the surface data suggested. And that realization marked the first major pivot in the investigation because as agents followed the financial threads, they confronted a chilling truth. The individuals being arrested represented only the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. Behind them, there appeared to be an entire system that had been operating smoothly for years, systematically exploiting the very legal gaps that enforcement protocols should have sealed. As ICE and FBI agents continued analyzing records that initially appeared disconnected, the overall picture transformed completely. The immigration enforcement operation was no longer confined to street-level violence or individual criminal histories. Instead, Minnesota was emerging as the geographic epicenter of one of the largest welfare fraud systems in American history. According to federal investigative documents, what was being uncovered were not isolated incidents of program exploitation. This was an organized structure that had operated continuously for years, directly exploiting humanitarian programs designed to protect the most vulnerable populations in American society. Investigators described the scale with a single word: breathtaking. 3 categories of programs immediately came under intensive scrutiny. First, child nutrition programs established to ensure that impoverished children did not go hungry. Second, Medicaid, the foundational healthcare system for low-income individuals. Third, social housing programs designed to help vulnerable populations access stable housing. On paper, these represented essential safety net functions. In the hands of criminal operators, they had been transformed into money-generating machines. The most extensively documented case centered on Feeding Our Future, a nonprofit organization licensed to distribute meals to children during the COVID-19 pandemic. According to federal indictments, more than $300 million was systematically embezzled through fraudulent documentation, fabricated meal counts, and shell company structures. Facilities were listed as serving thousands of meals daily, when in reality, many locations did not exist at all, or operated as completely empty storefronts. What disturbed investigators was not merely the monetary scale, it was the velocity and efficiency of the fraudulent system. Federal funds were dispersed on regular schedules with minimal verification and immediately channeled through multiple layered accounts. In documented cases, welfare funds were directly used to purchase luxury real estate, high-end vehicles, designer jewelry, and cryptocurrency, all occurring beneath the radar of regulatory oversight. According to anti-fraud specialists interviewed by federal investigators, the explanation resided in the emergency context. During crisis periods like the pandemic, governments are forced to prioritize rapid fund distribution. Verification procedures are relaxed. Post-disbursement audits replace pre-disbursement checks. And organized criminal actors understand precisely how to exploit that environment. They know how to construct a legitimate facade, retain professional accountants and attorneys, and cultivate a respectable public image that deflects suspicion. When the entire system operates on institutional trust, manipulating a single link can redirect entire funding streams. According to court records, Minnesota functioned not merely as a location where fraud occurred, but as a coordination hub for the broader network. Shell companies shared physical addresses, legal representatives, and interconnected fund flows. Multiple individuals arrested during Metro Surge appeared simultaneously in welfare fraud case files. A coincidence that investigators assessed could not be attributable to chance. By late 2025, dozens of defendants had been convicted. Many faced lengthy prison sentences and tens of millions of dollars in restitution obligations. But even as sentences were being handed down, a critical question persisted in classified intelligence reports. Not all of the money remained within the United States. International transactions, cryptocurrency wallet movements, and complex wire transfer sequences began appearing throughout the data. Some funds vanished entirely after exiting the American banking system, and this is precisely where the investigation pivoted toward a far more dangerous dimension. Because if hundreds of millions, potentially billions, of American taxpayer dollars had flowed overseas, then the question was no longer confined to fraud. The question had become, where did that money go after it left the United States? Before investigators could complete their accounting of domestic fraud losses, a new detail emerged in classified federal reports that immediately elevated the entire investigation to a different operational level. A significant portion of the stolen funds had not remained in Minnesota or even within American borders. It had crossed international boundaries. According to federal law enforcement sources, substantial welfare fraud proceeds were transferred overseas through a sophisticated money transmission network, including intermediary shell corporations, accounts held in the names of proxies, and transaction methods that were inherently difficult to trace, including cryptocurrency conversions. These funds did not follow a single traceable path. They dispersed, fragmented through multiple channels, and then disappeared from the conventional American financial tracking system. It was at this juncture that national security analysts began escalating their concern assessments. In several reports referenced in the investigation, federal agencies expressed active concern that some portion of the money may have reached al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization linked to al-Qaeda operating primarily in Somalia and East Africa. This was not an allegation made lightly. It emerged from systematic examination of fund flows, personal relationship networks, and suspicious financial destination patterns. However, U.S. officials simultaneously emphasized a critical caveat. This was not a final determination. Establishing terrorist financing connections requires meeting exceptionally high evidentiary standards. A single analytical error could lead to fundamentally flawed conclusions. But the mere possibility of such a connection was sufficient to completely transform the character of the case. Within the American national security architecture, there exists a bright and unmistakable line. Financial fraud is a matter for the Justice Department and economic enforcement agencies. But when fraudulent funds risk being channeled to violent organizations operating abroad, the matter is immediately reclassified as a national security threat. This reclassification triggers the involvement of additional agencies, from FBI counterintelligence to DHS threat assessment units to specialized financial intelligence teams. From the Washington perspective, this represented an exceptionally dangerous scenario. American taxpayer dollars, funds specifically allocated to feed children, provide health care to the poor, and house the homeless. If those funds were being diverted to finance violence overseas, this represented more than a betrayal of public trust. It represented a strategic vulnerability, a vulnerability demonstrating that domestic welfare programs, if inadequately protected, could become operational links in global threat networks. Former security officials cited in investigative briefings noted that al-Shabaab has long sought to diversify its funding sources beyond ground-level smuggling and extortion operations. Exploiting Western funding streams, if such exploitation is confirmed, would reveal a new level of operational sophistication where the battlefield is no longer located in desert terrain or jungle environments, but within the welfare systems of developed democracies. Therefore, Operation Metro Surge is no longer characterized simply as an immigration or anti-fraud operation. It is increasingly being described as an effort to interrupt a dangerous chain reaction in which domestic economic crime could generate international security consequences. And as the scope of investigation continued expanding, so did the pressure on investigators. Federal presence intensified, arrests continued, and information began leaking to the public. This rapidly generated strong reactions within the United States because not everyone perceived the operation through the same lens. As the investigation expanded and federal presence became increasingly visible, domestic reactions escalated far beyond televised policy debates and social media commentary. Tensions rapidly spilled onto the streets of Minnesota and cities across the country. In multiple areas, particularly within immigrant communities, protests erupted repeatedly and intensified. People gathered outside government buildings, federal agency facilities, and locations where enforcement operations were actively underway. Signs, banners, and vocal opposition to ICE became ubiquitous, reflecting deep fears that federal operations had exceeded legitimate boundaries. In several hotspot locations, protests evolved beyond symbolic demonstration. Crowds attempted to physically obstruct arrests, surrounded federal vehicles, and directly confronted ICE agents at operational sites. Video footage circulating online captured tense moments where even minor actions could have triggered the situation to spiral completely out of control. Federal agents reported that attacks on ICE personnel had increased by more than 1,100% compared to prior periods. For federal law enforcement agencies, this was far more than a statistical data point. It was an indicator that the operating environment had become significantly more dangerous. Agents deployed to enforce federal orders now faced genuine risk of physical attack on American soil, not from organized criminal syndicates, but from angry crowds of civilians. However, Many local political leaders and community advocates offered a fundamentally different interpretation. They argued that large-scale federal operations had created an atmosphere of pervasive fear, eroding trust between residents and local law enforcement. Multiple cities reinforced sanctuary policies, arguing that close cooperation with federal immigration enforcement would cause immigrant communities to avoid contact with even local police, thereby undermining overall public safety. At the core of this confrontation was a collision between federal law and local policy. Under federal statute, agencies like ICE are obligated to enforce immigration law and execute orders related to national security. But at the local level, many governments prioritized social stability, protection of vulnerable community members, and de-escalation of tensions. Both sides cited legitimate justifications, and both sides believed they were protecting the public interest. The problem was that as tensions escalated, those directly bearing the risk were the individuals on the front lines. Federal agents were forced to operate in increasingly hostile conditions. Local residents lived amidst enforcement campaigns, protest movements, and heavy security presence. The space for dialogue was progressively being filled by suspicion and confrontation. From the national security perspective, federal officials warned that any weakening in enforcement capabilities would be immediately exploited by criminal networks. But from the social perspective, community advocates argued that security cannot be sustainably achieved at the cost of prolonged division and institutionalized fear. The crisis, therefore, was no longer simply about fraud, immigration, or cross-border money flows. It had become a fundamental test of American governance. How does a society enforce law and protect security without driving its communities toward the edge of fracture? And the decisive question remained unanswered. When federal law and local policy collide directly, who ultimately bears the cost? The early morning raid in Los Angeles concluded with breached doors, sealed hard drives, and a mansion that had been transformed from a symbol of wealth into an active crime scene. But as investigators rapidly recognized, this was not an ending. It was merely the final visible piece of a far larger picture. From Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota, where over 4,000 individuals with deportation orders were apprehended, to the exposure of a multi-billion-dollar fraud empire systematically exploiting American humanitarian welfare programs, this sequence of events reveals a stark operational reality. Modern criminal networks do not function in isolation. They thrive precisely in the gaps between systems, where coordination failures, political pressures, and eroded institutional trust intersect to create exploitable vulnerabilities. From the perspective of the federal government, these operations are characterized as efforts to restore order and protect public safety. The argument is direct. When financial fraud, human trafficking, and money laundering achieve industrial scale, they cease to be purely economic issues. They become security threats capable of generating consequences that extend far beyond American borders. But simultaneously, the domestic response paints a significantly more complex picture. Concerns about civil rights, the safety of immigrant communities, and the appropriate role of local governments raise fundamental questions about whether current enforcement approaches are genuinely sustainable or whether they are creating new fractures in an already strained society. And it is here that the story reaches its current chapter without delivering a simple resolution. Are existing policies robust enough to prevent the emergence of similar networks in the future? Where should the line between protecting communities and enforcing law with maximum force be drawn? These questions remain open and will likely continue shaping debates about American security, governance, and policy for years to come. If you have your own perspective on what is truly occurring behind these federal enforcement campaigns, share your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe to Military Power to continue following these investigations, the behind-the-scenes developments, and the untold stories about security, power, and the systems that operate beyond public visibility.